London, 1815. The city breathes a strange mixture of hope and dread. Coal smoke hangs thick in the damp winter air, mixing with the stench of overflowing cesspits and crowded churchyards. The Napoleonic Wars have ended, and Britain stands victorious, yet its capital is a place of contradictions, a glittering hub of commerce and empire sitting uneasily atop a mountain of poverty, disease, and death. The poor huddle in narrow lanes where sewage runs in open ditches, while the wealthy attend glittering salons or stroll past the marble facades of new institutions dedicated to science, progress, and the promise of knowledge. But behind that promise lurks a disturbing truth, one that most Londoners would rather not confront. For in this year, beneath the soil of countless parish cemeteries, a shadow economy flourishes, one that turns the freshly dead into currency for a growing empire of medical education. The city's anatomy schools are booming. Surgeons and physicians, inspired by the Enlightenment and determined to unlock the mysteries of the human body, need corpses to dissect, to study, to teach. Yet the law is clear. Only the bodies of executed criminals may be handed over for dissection. That supply is pitifully small, while the hunger for knowledge is vast. A single anatomy class might require dozens of cadavers, each used and discarded in a few weeks' time. Students from across Europe crowd into London's lecture halls, desperate to learn, and professors, desperate to satisfy them, look the other way when bodies arrive by means best left unspoken. Out of this imbalance between need and legality grows a new profession, one whispered about with dread in taverns and across churchyards alike, the resurrection men. They are not ghosts, though they may as well be. Moving at night, armed with wooden spades to muffle the scrape of metal against soil, these men rob the graves of London's dead. They bribe sextons, cut deals with watchmen, and strike bargains in the kingdom of savagery. Over the course of 25 years, their family would grow into a clan nearly 50 strong, children and grandchildren born of incest and raised in darkness. This was no ordinary family. This was a community whose survival depended on ambushing unsuspecting travelers, dragging them into the cave, slaughtering them, and feasting upon their flesh. The remains were salted for preservation, limbs hung like butchered meat, and bones tossed aside until the cavern itself became a grotesque charnel house. For locals, the disappearances were inexplicable. Families vanished along the roads. Merchants never returned. Entire groups disappeared without a trace. The countryside lived in fear, and the roads grew silent as suspicion mounted. Something was devouring the land's lifeblood, and whispers grew louder that monsters walked among them. But what truly chills is not simply the idea of cannibalism. It is the possibility that this horror was sustained for decades, hidden in plain sight, without detection. Could a clan of nearly 50 people, living in filth and darkness, truly evade discovery for so long? Could an entire countryside fall prey to a family of killers without once suspecting their presence? These are the questions that have haunted historians, folklorists, and storytellers for centuries. And yet, in 1726, the story was presented not as folklore but as fact. Newspapers, pamphlets, and storytellers alike spread the tale of the cannibal clan of Sawney Bean, insisting that these horrors had unfolded within living memory. For a terrified population, the story explained the unexplainable. It gave shape to fear, a name to the darkness, and a villain to hate. To hear the details is to descend into nightmare. Strangers slaughtered in ambushes. The screams of travelers echoing into the night, swallowed by the roar of the sea. Children raised without knowledge of the outside world, their entire lives defined by murder and feasting. Flesh carved and salted, a grotesque pantry hidden beneath the earth. The cave itself was said to smell of decay, its floor slick with gore, its shadows filled with bones gnawed down to splinters. This was a place where humanity had been inverted, where the very bonds of kinship were perverted into something monstrous. In this story, Sawney Bean was not merely a criminal. He was the embodiment of barbarism, a living refutation of civilization itself. And yet, there is another layer, one that makes the story even more unsettling. The tale of Sawney Bean was not only about cannibalism, it was about otherness. In the early 18th century, Scotland was viewed by many in England as a wild, untamed place filled with rebels, witches, and savages. What better way to cement that image than with a tale of an inbred Scottish clan that rejected all notions of decency? For some historians, Sawney Bean was not a man but a myth weaponized for political propaganda. A story told to paint the Scots as uncivilized beasts, to reinforce divisions between peoples, and to terrify audiences with the suggestion that savagery still lurked just beyond the civilized world. In this sense, the horror is twofold: the horror of the cannibal clan, and the horror of realizing that such tales may have been crafted not as truth but as tools of control. As the mist curls around the cliffs of Ayrshire, one can almost picture it: the narrow road, the sudden ambush, the desperate struggle for survival. Was it history? Was it myth? Or was it something in between? A distorted memory of real crimes exaggerated until they became larger than life? This is the mystery we must confront as we step deeper into the shadows of 1726 Scotland. For whether Sawney been truly lived or was born of propaganda, his legend endures. It endures because it embodies the darkest of human fears: the fear of becoming prey, the fear of what lurks unseen in the wilderness, and the fear that civilization is only a thin veil over something primal and unspeakable. Sawney Bean may be gone, but his story still devours us, piece by piece, in the imagination. To truly understand why the story of Sawney Bean took such deep root in 18th century Scotland, we must first step back and look at the nation itself in 1726. This was a land in transition, caught between two worlds. On the surface, Scotland was becoming part of a modernizing Europe, influenced by the Enlightenment, new philosophies, and the promise of progress. But beneath that fragile veneer, poverty, superstition, and brutal realities defined daily life. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that the legend of a cannibal clan could take hold and spread like wildfire. The early 18th century was a time of political and social upheaval. Only a few decades earlier, Scotland had endured the aftershocks of failed uprisings, most famously the Jacobite rebellions, where loyalty to the Stuart monarchy clashed with the dominance of the British Crown. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, especially in the Highlands and western coasts. To outsiders, especially the English, the Scottish people were often portrayed as wild, backward, and barbaric. This perception created fertile ground for stories like that of Sawney Bean, a tale that could confirm the worst stereotypes, that Scotland was not only rebellious but primitive, a place where monsters thrived. Yet life for ordinary Scots was not about grand politics. It was about survival. The land was rugged, the soil often unforgiving, and famine was never far away. In such conditions, desperation could drive communities to unthinkable acts. Stories of starvation leading to cannibalism were not unheard of. During the harshest winters, when crops failed and livestock perished, some families whispered of neighbors driven mad by hunger. These accounts, whether true or exaggerated, lingered in cultural memory, shaping the idea that cannibalism was not just a monstrous act but a possibility lurking on the edges of starvation. Thus, when tales spread of an entire family feasting on human flesh, people could imagine it, because the hunger in their own bellies reminded them of how thin the line was between civilization and savagery. Religion also played its role. The Church in Scotland held enormous sway over communities, and its sermons often painted vivid pictures of sin, damnation, and the devil's temptations. The wilderness was depicted as a place of danger, where evil lurked beyond the reach of God's grace. The coastlines, caves, and moors were described in language steeped in fear: barren, haunted, cursed. To live outside the community, to reject honest work, to spurn the church, these were not merely rebellious acts, but signs of consorting with darkness itself. Sawney Bean's story fit neatly into this framework. A man who rejected honest labor, fled into the wilderness, and birthed a brood of devilish children sustained by murder and sin. For a religious audience, the tale was not just horrific, it was a warning about what happened when people turned away from God. At the same time, the justice system of the era was brutal and theatrical. Public executions, burnings, and dismemberments were part of everyday life. Punishments were designed to terrify, to make examples of criminals, and to reinforce the authority of the Crown and the Church. Against this backdrop, a story of mass cannibalism carried extra weight. If discovered, such criminals would not only be executed but annihilated in ways meant to cleanse the land of their presence. To the people of Scotland, this was not merely legend, it was consistent with the terrifying reality of how justice was carried out. In 1726, violence was not an abstract fear. It was a public spectacle, a reminder that cruelty lurked both in the wilderness and in the marketplace gallows. Folklore itself also shaped how people understood the world. Scotland was rich with oral traditions, stories told by firesides and passed through generations. Tales of monsters, witches, kelpies, and spirits were woven into daily life. These stories were not treated as entertainment alone but as moral lessons, warnings, and explanations for the unexplainable. Disappearances on lonely roads, deaths that could not be accounted for, and the strange cries carried on the wind all needed stories to explain them. Sawney Bean became one such explanation, his clan a human version of the supernatural monsters already known to Scottish folklore. Instead of fairies or demons devouring travellers, here was a flesh-and-blood family, lurking in a cave, proving that sometimes the greatest horror was human. It is important to remember that communication in 1726 was not instantaneous. News travelled slowly, shaped by rumour, pamphlets, and word of mouth. A story could grow in the telling, details exaggerated, horrors amplified. By the time Sawney Bean's tale reached the ears of distant listeners, it had transformed into something far larger than life. A handful of disappearances could become dozens. A family of outlaws could become a clan of 50 cannibals. In this way, folklore and fact blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The people of Scotland, primed by hardship, superstition, and fear, were ready to believe it all. We must also consider the geography itself. Scotland's rugged coasts and remote caves provided a natural stage for legends of hidden horrors. The Ayrshire coast, where Sawney Bean was said to dwell, is littered with sea caves carved by centuries of waves. These caves are deep, winding, and often impenetrable without torches. For people of the time, such places were inherently terrifying, dark hollows where light could not reach, where smugglers, criminals, or worse might hide. To imagine a family living within such a cave was not far-fetched. The setting lent credibility to the story. Even today, when one visits the coast and peers into those yawning mouths of stone, it is easy to imagine something unspeakable waiting within. Finally, there was propaganda. By 1726, printed pamphlets and broadsides were popular ways to spread sensational stories. Publishers knew that nothing sold better than tales of blood and horror. The Sawney Bean narrative was ideal, shocking, grotesque, and uniquely Scottish in a way that could titillate English readers. The story served not only as entertainment but as a cultural weapon. By painting Scots as capable of such horrors, it reinforced political divisions. It depicted the Highlands and Western coasts as lawless frontiers, places where barbarity thrived unchecked. In this way, the Sawney Bean legend was more than a story. It was a mirror reflecting the fears, prejudices, and tensions of its time. So when we hear of Sawney Bean's cannibal clan in 1726, we must understand the soil in which the story grew. A nation torn by politics, haunted by famine, bound by superstition, shaped by folklore, and manipulated by propaganda. It was in this cauldron of fear and fascination that the legend thrived. To the people of Scotland, the idea of a hidden family of cannibals was not simply believable, it was inevitable. And in believing it, they found a way to explain the darkness pressing in from every side. The story of Sawney Bean begins, like so many tales of monstrous infamy, with an ordinary man, or at least, with the suggestion of one. His name, according to legend, was Alexander Bean, though he would be remembered forever by the cruel nickname Sawney, a term often used at the time as a slur for Scotsmen in general. In his story, we glimpse the outlines of a man who rejected not only the conventions of society but the very essence of human decency. Yet when we look closer, the details grow murky, the boundaries between fact and folklore dissolve, and Sawney Bean becomes as much a symbol as a man, a construct shaped by fear, politics, and imagination. To understand his role in this legend, we must first unravel who he was said to be and why his story captured the imagination of generations. Accounts claim that Sawney Bean was born into humble circumstances in East Lothian, near Edinburgh. His father was described as a ditch digger or hedger, a man of rough work, and from childhood Sawney seemed uninterested in honest labour. Unlike his peers, who grew up learning trades, tending fields, or seeking apprenticeships, Sawney supposedly scorned work altogether. He was portrayed as lazy, vicious, and possessed of a cruel disposition. In some versions of the tale, he was said to have dabbled in petty theft and violence, never able to hold steady employment, always seeking an easier path to survival. His disdain for ordinary life marked him as an outsider long before his descent into infamy. At some point in his youth, Sawney encountered a woman who would become his partner in every dark endeavour. She was described as equally depraved, a woman accused of witchcraft, shunned from her community, or already steeped in criminality. Together, they formed a partnership bound not by love but by a shared rejection of morality. In this pairing, storytellers found a fitting seed for what would become a dynasty of horror. Two outcasts who turned their backs on society, choosing instead to build a world of their own in the shadows. Legends often work this way. They take an individual's flaws and exaggerate them until they become the foundation of an entire mythos. Sawney and his unnamed wife were not merely rebels against social norms. They were portrayed as the very antithesis of civilization. It was this union that set them on a path toward the coast of Ayrshire, where they discovered Benane Cave. In that natural fortress, hidden from the eyes of authority, they could live without fear of interference. But survival demanded more than isolation. According to the tale, it was here that the fateful decision was made, to ambush travelers, murder them, and consume their flesh. Whether out of necessity, cruelty, or both, this choice defined their existence. From that moment forward, Sawney Bean was no longer merely a criminal. He became a predator, one whose prey was human. The story insists that over the next 2 decades, Sawney and his wife raised a family within that cave, producing children and grandchildren through incestuous unions. This detail is central to the legend, for it transforms Sawney from a lone outlaw into the patriarch of a monstrous clan. He was not only a killer but a father who bred new generations into savagery, creating a self-contained society of murderers. The number of his descendants is often exaggerated, sometimes reported as dozens, other times as nearly 50. This inflation serves a symbolic purpose. By imagining an ever-expanding brood, the tale emphasizes not just Sawney's corruption but the idea of evil reproducing itself, growing in secret until it threatens the wider world. In stories told across taverns and marketplaces, Sawney himself is described in monstrous terms. He is depicted as large, brutish, and intimidating, with a face twisted by cruelty. His leadership of the clan is portrayed as absolute, his word law within the cave, his appetite insatiable. But while he is painted as a figure of dominance, his wife is often given equal credit, or blame, for the horrors that unfolded. In some versions, she is even said to have been the true instigator, encouraging cannibalism from the start, driving Sawney toward greater acts of depravity. This dynamic reveals much about the fears of the era, anxieties about women who defied social norms, and the idea that female influence could corrupt men into sin. The Sawney Bean legend thus becomes more than a tale of one man. It is the story of a family corrupted from its foundation, a dynasty of darkness spawned from the choices of its patriarch. But in examining the details, we also encounter contradictions. If Sawney was truly born in East Lothian, why are there no parish records? If his crime spanned 25 years, why do official court documents not mention him until much later retellings? These inconsistencies point to the legend's folkloric roots. Sawney Bean may not have been a real man at all, but rather a vessel into which storytellers poured every fear they wished to convey: laziness, rejection of work, rejection of faith, rejection of law, and ultimately rejection of humanity itself. What makes Sawney's supposed character so fascinating is how perfectly it mirrors the stereotypes that outsiders, particularly the English, cast upon Scots in general. He was lazy, barbaric, resistant to civilization, violent, and insular. By attaching these traits to a single figure, the story created a villain who could embody an entire cultural prejudice. Sawney Bean, in this sense, was not merely a man but a caricature, a fictional Scot twisted into a monster to justify political and cultural superiority. It is no coincidence that Sawney itself was used as a derogatory term for Scots. By naming their cannibal villain Sawney, pamphleteers and storytellers ensured that audiences would associate Scottishness itself with barbarity. Still, the enduring power of the story lies in its ability to humanize evil. Sawney was not described as a mythical beast or supernatural monster. He was a man who made choices, who turned his back on his community, who raised children to kill, and who lived by feeding upon others. This realism makes the horror sharper, more intimate. Unlike legends of witches or demons, Sawney Bean's story forces us to confront the possibility that the greatest horrors are human in origin. That is why his figure continues to fascinate. He is not a ghost or a goblin. He is us, stripped of morality and civility, thriving only on blood. As we look deeper into his legend, we find ourselves questioning whether he ever truly existed. Was there an Alexander Bean? Or was he simply a creation, a patchwork of fears stitched together into a single monstrous figure? Either way, the role he plays in the narrative is undeniable. He is the dark heart of the tale, the patriarch of horror, the man whose name would echo through centuries. Sawney Bean may be a myth, but within that myth lies something far more terrifying: the suggestion that ordinary people, under the right conditions, can abandon every shred of humanity. And once that step is taken, there may be no return. Along the wild and unforgiving coast of Ayrshire lies a place that has, for centuries, been shrouded in whispers. Benane Cave, sometimes called Sawney Bean's lair, was said to be the heart of the legend, a cavern carved by the relentless tides of the North Channel, where the sea crashes endlessly against black stone. To those who dared approach, it was more than a natural feature of the coastline. It was a threshold between the civilized world and a realm of unspeakable horror. Within its depths, travelers were told, Sawney Bean and his monstrous brood carried out their grisly existence, a hidden kingdom of flesh and fear. To understand the legend, one must first enter this cave, not in body, but in imagination, and see it as those 18th century minds saw it, a place where daylight died and evil thrived. The cave itself is said to be vast, with a narrow, easily concealed entrance opening onto a labyrinth of dark passageways. Once inside, the sea's roar muffles, swallowed by winding chambers that stretch far into the rock. Some accounts claim the cave extended more than 1,000 feet, twisting and branching like the arteries of a colossal beast. By day, its entrance could be hidden by the tide, shielding its occupants from discovery. By night, it became a fortress of secrecy, where firelight flickered against slick walls and shadows danced like phantoms. To those outside, the coast appeared barren and uninhabited, but within, a family grew, thrived, and devoured. Descriptions of the Bean clan's lair paint it as a grotesque inversion of a home. Instead of livestock or crops, there were human carcasses. Instead of salted fish or game, there were preserved limbs, stacked and stored with a butcher's precision. Accounts speak of torsos hanging from hooks, arms and legs carved into portions, and barrels of pickled flesh meant to sustain the family through lean months. The cave was both dwelling and abattoir, a domestic space transformed into a charnel house. Even the simple act of preparing a meal became a ritual of horror, children growing up surrounded by butchered humanity as casually as others grew up among bread and milk. What gave the cave its enduring power in the imagination was its natural isolation. Hidden from prying eyes, it was the perfect stage for a legend about secrecy and fear. Travelers vanished without a trace. Their bodies were never found because, according to the story, they were dragged into this hollow, butchered, and consumed. The land offered no clues, only silence. The cave was the answer to that silence, a black hole into which lives disappeared. In the popular imagination, it became less a geological feature and more a living entity, a mouth that swallowed human beings whole, never to return them. The darkness within such a space carries symbolic weight. In folklore, caves are often thresholds to other worlds, places where natural law is suspended, where monsters dwell, and where human beings risk losing themselves. For people in 18th century Scotland, Benane Cave was not merely a hole in the rock, it was an abyss of moral corruption. To enter, it was to step into a world where the rules of society did not apply. In this light, the Beans' choice of dwelling carried allegorical meaning. They were not only rejecting work and community but literally retreating into darkness, making their home in the belly of the earth. They had ceased to be part of the human community and had become something else entirely, creatures of shadow. The environment itself would have been inhospitable. Cold, damp, and filled with the echo of dripping water, it was a place unsuited to human comfort. And yet, the story insists, an entire family lived here for decades. Children were born within these stone walls, never seeing the sun until they emerged to kill. Grandchildren grew up surrounded not by toys or hearths but by bones and salted flesh. The claustrophobic imagery of this existence heightens the horror. An entire dynasty reared in filth and secrecy, their very lives sustained by blood. In such surroundings, the boundary between necessity and ritual blurred. Cannibalism was not merely survival. It became culture, tradition, a family legacy etched into the cave walls. Even more horrifying is the idea of generations raised to know no other life. The children of Sawney Bean, if they existed, would never have tasted bread, never seen a ploughed field, never spoken to outsiders except in the moments before murdering them. Their universe was bounded by stone and blood. The cave was not only their home but their world, a prison of flesh where the outside was alien and hostile. For these children, the normal rhythms of society, marriage, work, faith, were replaced by incest, ambush, and slaughter. The cave was not just a hiding place, it was a crucible of monstrosity. To those who heard the tale, this detail made the Beans uniquely horrifying. A single cannibal might be explained by madness or desperation, but a family spanning generations suggested something far more terrifying, that evil could be inherited, taught, and normalized. The cave symbolized this twisted legacy, sheltering not just criminals but an entire culture of blood. Each generation grew within its walls, ensuring that the horror did not die but multiplied. Yet, even as the story terrifies, it provokes doubt. Could such a large family have lived undetected in a cave for decades? Could they have butchered hundreds, even thousands, without attracting notice sooner? Skeptics point to the implausibility of these claims, suggesting instead that the cave was chosen in the telling of the story precisely because of its geography. It was the perfect stage for a horror tale, remote, inaccessible, and inherently frightening. Whether or not Sawney Bean ever set foot in Benane Cave, it was the ideal backdrop for a legend designed to chill the imagination. Still, the power of the imagery cannot be denied. Even centuries later, visitors to the Ayrshire coast speak of an eerie sensation when gazing into the cave. The wind howls, the sea crashes, and the darkness within seems endless. It is easy to imagine unseen figures moving in the shadows, to hear phantom echoes of screams swallowed by stone. Rationally, we know it is only a cave. But the legend lingers, painting every drop of water and every jagged rock with blood. The cave has become inseparable from the tale itself, a symbol of secrecy, savagery, and the unholy transformation of family life into something monstrous. Whether Benane Cave was truly the lair of Sawney Bean or simply a convenient canvas for imagination, its place in the story is undeniable. It is the heart of the legend, the stage upon which horror unfolded. Without the cave, the Sawney Bean clan might have been remembered as little more than bandits or killers. With it, they became something more, a spectre of cannibalism haunting the coastline, a nightmare hidden in stone, a reminder that in the darkest places, humanity itself can be devoured. The legend of Sawney Bean and his clan would not have endured for centuries if not for the horror of what came next. Once settled in the isolation of Benane Cave, they were said to have unleashed a reign of terror that stretched for decades, a campaign of blood and fear that haunted the roads of Scotland and turned the countryside into a place of suspicion and dread. It was here that the story takes on its most chilling dimension, not just the existence of cannibals, but their sustained ability to hunt, kill, and feed on the innocent for more than 25 years without discovery. The method was brutally simple. By day, the clan hid in their cave, avoiding any exposure that might reveal their presence. By night, they emerged like predators from the shadows, lying in wait along the lonely roads that wound through the Ayrshire countryside. These routes were frequented by merchants, farmers, pilgrims, and families travelling between villages. Such people were vulnerable, often carrying goods or money, and more importantly, they were often alone or in small groups. The perfect prey. Ambushes were swift and merciless. The Beans, said to number nearly 50 at their height, would descend on unsuspecting travellers with overwhelming force. Victims were dragged screaming into the darkness, cut down where they stood, or silenced before help could ever arrive. For the unfortunate souls who crossed their path, there was no bargaining, no ransom, and no hope of survival. What awaited them was a grotesque fate, to be butchered and consumed as though they were livestock. The horror did not end with death. According to accounts, the Beans treated human flesh as others treated venison or beef. Bodies were dismembered with chilling precision. Limbs were stripped of muscle, torsos opened and drained, edible parts salted or pickled for preservation. What could not be eaten immediately was stored in the dank recesses of the cave, a macabre larder that ensured the clan never knew hunger. Even the bones were not always wasted. They were discarded in piles outside the cave or tossed into the sea, their presence a grim testimony that something monstrous lurked nearby. It is said that entire families vanished on the roads, their disappearance explained only years later when the Bean clan's lair was supposedly uncovered. Mothers, fathers, children, all fell victim. The scale of their crimes became legendary. Some versions of the tale insist the Beans killed more than 1,000 people over their reign. Others suggest the number was smaller but still horrifying. Either way, the sheer idea that a single family could consume so many lives turned the countryside into a place of constant paranoia. Travellers refused to venture out at night. Merchants travelled in armed convoys. Villagers whispered of witches, demons, or worse. Something was out there, and it was hunting them. Stories circulated of bloodstains found along the roads, of discarded clothing that bore no bodies, of horses returning riderless, their saddles empty. For the communities of Ayrshire, these mysteries demanded explanations. Yet none could be found. There were no known bandits in the region powerful enough to account for the losses. There were no great beasts reported capable of such carnage. And so, suspicion turned inward. Families accused one another. Strangers were looked upon with fear. For decades, the region was paralyzed by dread, a population living under the shadow of an enemy they could not name. The psychological toll was immense. In a world already scarred by famine, rebellion, and harsh justice, the idea that ordinary life itself, traveling, trading, visiting kin, might end in disappearance was unbearable. People clung to explanations, no matter how far-fetched. Some whispered of werewolves, creatures that took human form by day and feasted by night. Others blamed witches and sorcery, imagining covens dragging innocents away for sacrifice. But the truth, as the legend would have it, was far more terrifying. Not beasts, not demons, but fellow human beings committing acts so vile they might as well have been monsters. One of the most chilling aspects of the legend is its depiction of the clan acting together, coordinated in their ambushes and murders. This was not the work of one deranged man, but an entire family functioning as a unit. Fathers, mothers, children, and grandchildren alike took part in the slaughter. Imagine a scene where a traveler, already outnumbered, looks up to see not only men with weapons but women and even children joining the attack. In that moment, there would be no appeal to compassion, no plea that might reach a sympathetic ear. Every member of the family had been raised to see human beings as nothing more than prey. For those who later retold the story, this detail was crucial. It reinforced the horror that the Beans were not isolated deviants but a corrupted society in miniature, a self-sustaining community built on cannibalism and murder. Their very existence suggested that evil could spread like a disease, infecting generations until an entire bloodline was rotten. The idea that children could grow up knowing nothing but violence and flesh-eating horrified listeners, for it suggested that humanity itself was fragile, easily warped, and perhaps always vulnerable to corruption. Of course, the scale of the killings also strains belief. Could such crimes truly go undetected for so long? Could hundreds vanish without leaving behind enough evidence to provoke serious investigation? Skeptics argue that the numbers were inflated, the horrors exaggerated to make the story more compelling. But in the 18th century, exaggeration did not diminish its impact. If anything, the larger the claim, the greater the terror it inspired. Whether the Beans killed dozens or thousands, the legend had done its work. It planted the fear that no road was safe, that no traveler was beyond danger, that any journey could end in an ambush leading straight into the mouth of the cave. And then there is the question of why such a family would continue this pattern for decades rather than fleeing or dispersing. Here, the legend insists on their arrogance, their sense of security in their hidden cave. Having lived undetected for so long, they believed themselves untouchable. The sea concealed their home, the tides masked their comings and goings, and the fear of the countryside ensured that no one dared search too closely. The Beans had, in effect, created a reign of terror so effective that their very existence discouraged investigation. People were too afraid to look, and so the killings continued. The reign of terror attributed to Sawney Bean and his clan became the beating heart of the legend. It was not just the cave that horrified, nor merely the idea of cannibalism. It was the relentless, systematic hunting of innocents, the image of family after family dragged screaming into the dark. It was the sense that evil had become routine, ordinary, woven into the nightly rhythms of the Scottish coast. Whether real or imagined, the story left its mark, a reminder that safety is an illusion, that darkness may conceal horrors beyond comprehension, and that sometimes the deadliest predators are not beasts of the forest, but people who look like us, act together, and feast without remorse. To imagine life inside the Sawney Bean clan is to imagine a world turned upside down, a mirror image of civilization in which everything we take for granted as human was corrupted beyond recognition. If the legend is to be believed, what happened inside the cave was not merely survival. It was the creation of a new society, a grotesque parody of family and community where cannibalism was the foundation of existence. The Beans did not just consume human flesh, they built a life around it, raised their children within it, and normalized it until it became their culture. In this sense, their story is not only one of murder but of an entire way of life, horrific in its intimacy. The structure of this hidden family was said to be patriarchal. Sawney himself ruled with absolute authority, his word final, his commands obeyed without question. Yet, his wife was more than a passive participant. In some versions, she was the instigator, the one who first suggested murder as a way to sustain their outlaw existence. Together, they raised children in the dark womb of the cave, teaching them not only how to survive but how to kill. These children were given no chance to escape the life into which they were born. From infancy, they were surrounded by the sights, smells, and rituals of slaughter. For them, human flesh was not taboo. It was food. Murder was not a crime. It was tradition. One of the most disturbing elements of the story is the claim of incest within the clan. Cut off from the outside world, the children of Sawney and his wife were said to intermarry among themselves, producing grandchildren who were equally indoctrinated into the culture of cannibalism. The family tree twisted inward, each branch folding back upon itself until what remained was no longer a family in the human sense, but a closed system, a cycle of blood and flesh perpetuating itself. In the imagination of those who told the tale, this incestuous breeding served as a metaphor for corruption. The longer the beings remained hidden, the more diseased and degenerate their society became. Daily life, as described in the legend, revolved around ambush, butchery, and feasting. At night, the clan would leave the cave in coordinated hunting parties, returning with their victims. Once inside, the grisly work began. Men, women, and even children were stripped of clothing, their possessions sorted, and their bodies reduced to food. Meat was cut, salted, and stored. In the flickering glow of torches, children watched as their elders carved the dead, and in time, they learned to do it themselves. The act of preparing a meal became indistinguishable from the act of committing murder. This fusion of domesticity and violence is what made the legend so chilling. In the Bean household, dinner began with the slaughter of innocents. The economy of the Beans was one of flesh. Unlike ordinary families, who sustained themselves on crops, livestock, or trade, this family relied entirely on the bodies of their victims. Salted flesh replaced bread, bones replaced tools. Discarded clothes and valuables formed a hidden hoard within the cave. Over time, the family accumulated a grim inventory of stolen goods, gold coins, jewelry, weapons, and household items. Yet they had no way of spending or trading them without exposing themselves. Thus, the wealth piled up uselessly, evidence of countless murders, while the true sustenance of the family remained human bodies. It was an economy that had no connection to the outside world, entirely self-contained, grotesque, and parasitic. What fascinates and horrifies in equal measure is how normalized this life must have become within the clan. For children born into it, there was no comparison point. They had never seen a farm, never tasted milk from a cow, never visited a marketplace. For them, meat did not come from animals, it came from travelers. Family meals were taken in the gloom of the cave. The taste of human flesh passed from parent to child as naturally as one might pass down recipes. The screams of victims were not shocking but routine, background noise in a world where death was simply part of life. The incestuous breeding and insular culture suggest that the Beans, if real, would have become increasingly detached from anything recognizable as human society. Language may have deteriorated, traditions would have been warped beyond recognition, and even physical appearance may have carried signs of inbreeding. Some accounts claim the children and grandchildren were feral in demeanor, wild-eyed, and animalistic. Others insist they were disturbingly normal in appearance, a detail that only added to the horror. They looked human, but they were not. The ambiguity between monster and man deepened the fear. Beyond the grisly details, the legend serves as a commentary on what happens when human beings abandon community and morality. In Sawney Bean's cave, family bonds did not create warmth or safety, they created complicity. Every member of the clan was implicated in the murders. No child could plead innocence, no mother could claim ignorance. In this society, everyone had blood on their hands. The very structure of family, which in most societies nurtures life, was inverted here to sustain death. At the same time, there is an eerie practicality to their alleged lifestyle. They hunted, they killed, they ate, and they survived. In its coldest terms, the clan was efficient. They left no bodies to be found, no survivors to tell tales. Their home was concealed by tides, their numbers large enough to overpower victims, their methods refined through repetition. In this sense, the Beans were portrayed not as reckless but as chillingly effective. They were predators, honed by decades of practice, and their existence reminded audiences of the fragility of civilization. Remove the structures of law, faith, and community, and what remains? According to the legend, what remains is Sawney Bean and his family. Survival stripped of morality, humanity stripped of compassion. Skeptics point out that this depiction of a cannibal economy serves a symbolic purpose more than a factual one. The idea of an entire family living solely on human flesh strains credulity. Yet the story's power lies not in plausibility but in its allegory. It suggests that without the restraints of society, human beings could revert to primal appetites, devouring each other in the dark. In that sense, the Bean family becomes less a literal clan and more a metaphor for the collapse of civilization. They were the nightmare lurking at the edges of Scottish life, a reminder of what lay beyond the fragile light of order. For listeners in 1726, this detail of a cannibal economy would have been especially shocking because it inverted everything they valued. Family became corruption. Home became cave. Food became flesh. Work became murder. In every respect, the Beans lived as a twisted reflection of normal society. And it was this inversion, as much as the violence itself, that made the story unforgettable. It was not just a tale of killers. It was a vision of an entire community built on horror. For decades, the legend insists, Sawney Bean and his clan thrived in the shadows, preying upon the roads of Ayrshire and leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. But every reign of terror eventually falters, and for the Beans, it would all come crashing down with a single ambush that went wrong. This moment, retold in countless pamphlets and histories, marks the turning point of the story, the moment when secrecy gave way to exposure, when victims fought back, and when justice, brutal and unrelenting, finally descended upon the cave. The tale begins with a husband and wife travelling along a lonely road, returning from a fair or pilgrimage depending on the version told. They were mounted on horseback, enjoying the safety of daylight and the belief that the worst of their journey was behind them. But as the shadows lengthened and the road narrowed, the Bean clan struck. Emerging from the cover of brush and rock, the family surrounded the couple with terrifying speed, a mass of men, women, and even children armed with crude weapons. For the travellers, what appeared to be ordinary people revealed themselves as predators. The ambush followed the familiar pattern: overwhelm the victims, drag them into the darkness, butcher them, and feast. But on this occasion, something was different. The man fought back with a ferocity the Beans had not anticipated. Armed with sword and pistol, he resisted their attempt to pull him from his horse. His wife, however, was not so fortunate. As the battle raged, she was dragged screaming from her mount, pinned to the ground, and butchered before her husband's eyes. Some accounts say she was disemboweled on the spot, her blood soaking into the earth, her cries echoing into the night. The horror of her fate drove her husband into a frenzy of survival. He fired his pistol into the crowd, slashing with his sword, determined not to join her in death. For the first time in decades of hunting, the Beans found themselves facing prey that would not yield. The noise of the fight carried farther than they expected, and fate, or chance, intervened. A group of travellers returning from the same fair arrived on the road, stumbling upon the bloody struggle. Seeing the odds turn, the Beans hesitated. The husband's desperate defence, combined with the sudden appearance of reinforcements, forced them to retreat into the shadows. For the first time, they left a survivor behind. The man, though grief-stricken at the sight of his butchered wife, lived to tell his story. He rode with the other travellers to the nearest town, where his wounds were tended, and his testimony spread like wildfire. At last, there was tangible evidence of the nightmare. Until now, the disappearances had been unexplained, shrouded in rumour. But here was a survivor with fresh wounds, blood on his clothing, and a horrific story of ambush and slaughter. The terror that had long haunted Ayrshire suddenly had a name and a face. Authorities were quick to act. In some versions, word travelled all the way to the king himself, James VI of Scotland in earlier accounts, or King George in later retellings. Outraged by the scale of the alleged crimes, the monarch supposedly ordered a massive search and dispatched soldiers alongside trackers and bloodhounds to scour the countryside. Whether the king's personal involvement is truth or embellishment, the detail added grandeur and authority to the legend. This was not merely a local affair, it was a crime so heinous that it drew the wrath of the crown. The search was relentless. Soldiers combed the roads, villages, and coastlines. At first, they found nothing. But the dogs, trained to track the scent of blood, led them to the remote cliffs of Benane. There, hidden by the tide and almost invisible from above, they found the entrance to the cave. What they discovered inside would become the stuff of nightmares. According to the accounts, the soldiers pushed deeper into the cave, their torches casting flickering light on the walls. What began as the stench of rot grew stronger with every step. Soon they came upon the grisly evidence of the Beans' crimes: piles of bones stacked against the walls, limbs hanging from hooks like cuts of meat, barrels filled with pickled flesh, and clothing and valuables stripped from countless victims. The horror was beyond anything they could have imagined. This was no mere hideout, it was a slaughterhouse. And there, in the depths of the cavern, they found the clan itself. Dozens of men, women, and children cowered in the shadows, their eyes wide, their bodies filthy and feral. Some accounts describe them attempting to fight back, shrieking and clawing like animals when soldiers advanced. Others claim they surrendered in fear, unable to match the organized force of armed men. Regardless of the details, the effect was the same. The secret reign of the Sawney Bean clan was over. The capture of the family marked the climax of the legend. a moment when hidden evil was dragged into the light. For the people of Scotland, the discovery of the cave explained decades of disappearances. The mystery had a solution, and the solution was worse than anyone could have imagined. To the soldiers who entered the cave, it must have seemed as though they had stumbled into hell itself, a place where humanity had been stripped away and replaced by hunger and depravity. This dramatic capture cemented the tale in cultural memory. It provided closure to the long years of fear, but it also heightened the horror. The people had been right to fear the roads, right to suspect that something monstrous was at work. Now they had proof, and the proof was almost too terrible to bear. The Bean family, once thought of as mere whispers and shadows, were revealed as flesh and blood. And soon, that flesh and blood would be subjected to the full force of 18th century justice. When the soldiers emerged from Benane Cave with Sawney Bean and his brood, they did not merely arrest criminals, they unveiled monsters to the eyes of a horrified public. The capture was only the beginning of a spectacle that would end in one of the most brutal mass executions ever recorded in legend. In the story's telling, the Beans were dragged from their dark lair into the harsh light of justice, a family whose every breath was steeped in blood and whose every meal was made of human flesh. What followed was less a trial than an act of collective retribution, where the machinery of justice merged with the theatre of vengeance. The family was said to number close to 50, men, women, and children, all products of Sawney and his wife's twisted dynasty. Shackled and filthy, they were paraded through towns on their way to Edinburgh or Glasgow, depending on which version of the legend one hears. Crowds gathered in disbelief as the procession passed, staring at the clan as though they were wild beasts captured from a forest. Their very existence was an abomination. Children who had never known innocence, mothers who had raised offspring only to train them as killers, and fathers who had butchered strangers without remorse. For the people who lined the roads, it was not simply justice, it was vindication. All the missing loved ones, all the years of fear, all the unanswered disappearances now had a face. What makes this part of the tale especially haunting is the insistence that there was no trial. In the normal course of law, even the vilest of criminals were given hearings, however brief, before a judge. But for Sawney Bean and his clan, no such formality was observed. The crimes were considered too monstrous, too unforgivable, to warrant any defense. The very sight of their lair, with its butchered remains and piles of bones, was taken as proof beyond doubt. Authorities, according to the legend, declared that the clan had forfeited all rights to mercy. They would be executed, swiftly and brutally, their blood cleansing the land of their presence. The execution itself was described in detail, and those details were calculated to horrify as much as to satisfy a thirst for vengeance. The men of the clan, Sawney, his sons, and grandsons, were dismembered alive. Their hands and feet were hacked off first, their limbs severed one by one as punishment for the countless limbs they themselves had severed in their cave. Only after this prolonged torment were their throats cut or their bodies left to bleed out, writhing in agony before the jeering crowds. The women and children fared no better. They were condemned to be burned alive, cast into great pyres as punishment for their complicity in the crimes. Together, the spectacle erased the entire bloodline in a single wave of state-sanctioned violence. To modern ears, such a punishment sounds almost too extreme, but in the 18th century, public executions were both entertainment and instruction. They were meant to terrify onlookers, to reinforce the boundaries between good and evil, and to remind all that the Crown and Church held ultimate authority over life and death. The annihilation of the Sawney Bean clan was not just justice, it was theatre, a ritual designed to purge fear and to restore order. As flames consumed the women and children, and as the screams of Sawney's sons echoed through the crowd, the audience was reminded of the dangers of lawlessness, of turning away from God, and of the horrors that awaited those who lived outside the bonds of society. In some versions of the story, Sawney himself remained defiant to the end. Shackled and mutilated, he is said to have cursed the crowd, swearing that the land would never be rid of him, that his name would live on in terror long after his body was reduced to ashes. This defiance served the narrative well, ensuring that the monster did not die quietly but left behind a curse that echoed in the imaginations of those who heard the tale. Others portray him as cowardly, begging for mercy at the last, a pathetic figure reduced from predator to prey. Either way, his final moments were remembered as a fitting end to a man whose life had been defined by cruelty. The public, watching the execution, was both horrified and satisfied. The horror came from the sheer brutality of the spectacle. Men torn apart alive, women shrieking in flames, children screaming as they perished. Yet satisfaction came from the belief that justice had been served, that the land was cleansed of a cancer that had devoured it for too long. In this way, the execution mirrored the crimes. Just as the Beans had butchered innocents in their cave, so too were they butchered before the eyes of society. Violence answered violence, blood answered blood. Yet, for all its theatrical power, this part of the story raises questions. If an entire family numbering in the dozens had been executed in such a public and spectacular fashion, why are there no reliable records in the courts or newspapers of the time? Why are there no eyewitness accounts beyond the pamphlets that spread the tale years later? Historians who doubt the legend point to this absence as evidence that the execution was part of the story's fictional embellishment. Perhaps there was never a Sawney Bean, never a clan, never a mass execution. Perhaps it was all a tale concocted to sell pamphlets and to slander the Scots as barbaric savages. But whether true or fabricated, the execution scene has endured in the telling because it provides catharsis. After hearing of decades of horror, audiences crave justice. The cave was terrifying, the murders grotesque, but the execution offered resolution. Evil had been exposed, dragged into the light, and destroyed utterly. Sawney Bean and his clan were not simply punished, they were obliterated, erased, denied even the dignity of burial. Their ashes scattered, their bones crushed, their memory consigned to infamy. The theatre of their deaths mirrored the theatre of their lives. Just as their cave had been a stage for horror, their execution ground became a stage for justice. Both were spectacles designed to inspire fear, both relied on blood to send their message, and both left behind scars in the imagination of all who heard the tale. Whether real or not, the annihilation of the Sawney Bean clan became the story's grim conclusion, sealing them forever as symbols of savagery, terror, and the relentless grip of vengeance. After the smoke cleared and the cries of the condemned fell silent, Scotland was left with more than just the memory of horror. It was left with a story that would travel across borders, across centuries, and across cultures. But when we strip away the spectacle and the grisly details, one pressing question remains. Was it true? Did Sawney Bean and his monstrous family ever exist? Or was the tale a fabrication born of fear, propaganda, and the hunger for sensational stories? The line between history and legend here is treacherously thin, and the closer we look, the more the certainty of fact dissolves into ambiguity. The first problem lies in the records, or rather, the lack of them. For a crime so spectacular, so unprecedented, we would expect detailed court documents, parish records, or contemporary chronicles. Yet there are none. No trial transcripts, no official proclamations, no parish accounts of an entire family wiped out in one of the most public executions imaginable. Instead, the earliest surviving mentions of Sawney Bean appear not in government records but in popular pamphlets and ballads, sources notorious for sensationalism, exaggeration, and outright invention. They were the tabloids of their day, crafted to shock, to titillate, and above all, to sell. This absence of reliable documentation has led many historians to doubt the very existence of the Beans. The next layer of doubt comes from the timing. The most influential printed versions of the Sawney Bean story emerged during the 18th century, a period when England and Scotland were undergoing a turbulent political relationship. The Act of Union in 1707 had fused the two nations, but resentment lingered. To many English readers, the Scots were seen as unruly, rebellious, and primitive. What better way to reinforce that stereotype than with a tale of a barbaric Scottish clan who not only rejected civilization but actively devoured it? By presenting Scots as literal cannibals, the pamphleteers provided English audiences with both horror and justification. Horror at the grotesque crimes, and justification for their sense of superiority. Scotland was not a land of enlightenment and progress, these tales implied, but a wilderness of monsters. It is worth noting that Sawney was itself a derogatory term, used by the English to mock Scotsmen in general. The name Sawney Bean may not have been a personal name at all but a constructed figure, a caricature meant to embody all the worst stereotypes of Scotland. In this light, the story takes on the shape not of history but of propaganda, a tale less about one family's crimes and more about an entire nation's image in the eyes of its neighbours. Sawney Bean was not just a cannibal. He was Scotland, twisted into a grotesque reflection of English prejudice. And yet, dismissing the story entirely as fiction is not so simple. For while official records may be silent, oral tradition in Scotland has preserved the tale for centuries. Local legends tie the Bean clan to Benane Cave, pointing to the geography as evidence that the story must have some root in fact. The coastline is filled with caves large enough to hide fugitives, and throughout history, outlaws and smugglers did indeed use such places as hideouts. In times of famine and war, Desperate people sometimes turned to acts that polite society considered unthinkable. Cannibalism, while rare, was not unknown in European history. Famines in the Middle Ages produced scattered reports of people consuming the dead. In this sense, the Bean's crimes, while extreme, were not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Some folklorists argue that the Sawney Bean story is less a single history and more a composite of fears and events woven together. There may have been real bandits who preyed upon travelers in Ayrshire. There may have been cases of cannibalism during times of starvation. There may even have been a family or community living in isolation whose existence became distorted in the retelling. Over time, these fragments could have fused into the legend of Sawney Bean, a myth that crystallized collective fears into one coherent narrative. The appeal of the story also lies in its structure, which mirrors other European legends of cannibals and outlaws. In France, tales of Gilles de Rais, a nobleman-turned-child murderer, horrified audiences in the 15th century. In Germany, the legend of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg, told of a man who devoured human flesh and consorted with the devil. These stories, like Sawney Bean's, combined crime, monstrosity, and moral instruction. They were not only accounts of horror but also allegories about sin, corruption, and the dangers of straying from God. Sawney Bean fits neatly into this tradition, suggesting that his story may have been shaped by broader European motifs of the cannibal outlaw. There is also the problem of numbers. The legend claims that the Bean clan murdered and consumed as many as 1,000 people. This figure, while effective in shocking audiences, is logistically implausible. Such a scale of disappearance would have devastated local communities, yet no such demographic collapse is recorded. More likely, the number was inflated for dramatic effect, transforming what might have been isolated crimes into an epic of terror. The exaggeration itself serves as evidence that the story was crafted for impact rather than accuracy. Yet, the absence of truth does not diminish the story's power. In fact, the very ambiguity is what makes it endure. If Sawney Bean was real, he represents the darkest extremes of human behavior, a reminder that civilization's veneer is thin. If he was a myth, he represents the power of storytelling to shape national identity and collective fear. Either way, he remains lodged in cultural memory, his name a byword for savagery. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the horror. Was there truly a cave filled with bones on the Ayrshire coast, or was it all imagination? The inability to answer keeps the legend alive. The story also reflects deeper anxieties about family and society. The Beans were not solitary killers. They were a clan, a dynasty, a community in miniature. Their horror lay not only in their crimes but in the fact that they created a world where murder and cannibalism were normalized, taught, and inherited. To an audience steeped in Christian morality, this inversion of family was shocking. Parents were meant to nurture life, not destroy it. Children were meant to grow in innocence, not in blood. By portraying an entire family as corrupted, the story delivered a message about the fragility of morality itself. In the end, whether Sawney Bean was a real man, a composite of local fears, or a fictional propaganda piece hardly matters to the story's endurance. Legends survive not because they are true but because they speak to something deeper. Sawney Bean's legend speaks to our fear of the wilderness, our fear of isolation, our fear of becoming prey. It speaks to cultural divisions, to the demonization of the other, and to the unsettling possibility that monsters are not supernatural beings but ordinary humans who make monstrous choices. Fact or fiction, Sawney Bean endures because he embodies the shadow we all carry, the knowledge that under the right conditions, humanity can devour itself. The legend of Sawney Bean, horrifying as it is, does not stand alone. It belongs to a much wider tapestry of human stories, accounts of cannibalism that stretch across continents and centuries. If we step beyond the dark cave on the Scottish coast, we find echoes of this fear in history, myth, and anthropology. To speak of cannibalism is to speak of one of humanity's oldest taboos, a line so deeply etched into our moral imagination that crossing it instantly places someone beyond the pale of civilization. And yet, history reveals that people have crossed it, sometimes by choice, sometimes by desperation, sometimes by belief. Sawney Bean may or may not have been real, but cannibalism most certainly has been. The most common and perhaps most forgivable form of cannibalism is survival cannibalism. When famine, shipwreck, or siege leaves no other option, people have, throughout history, turned to human flesh to stave off death. The Donner Party in the winter of 1846 is among the most infamous examples. Trapped by heavy snows in the Sierra Nevada, American pioneers resorted to eating the bodies of those who had already perished. The survivors told their stories reluctantly, ashamed yet alive. Similarly, during the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, archaeological evidence reveals that starving colonists in the starving time of 1609 to 1610 butchered and consumed at least one young girl, her bones bearing the marks of knives and cleavers. These were not tales of savages lurking in caves. They were desperate human beings pushed beyond endurance. Sieges, too, have produced documented cases of cannibalism. In the Great Famine of the Siege of Leningrad during World War II, reports surfaced of citizens resorting to human flesh when rations failed. Centuries earlier, during the Siege of Paris in 1870 and the Siege of Jerusalem in the 1st century, similar whispers emerged. In each of these, cannibalism was not born of culture or ideology but of starvation. When the human body becomes the last available source of sustenance, survival cannibalism strips away civilization's veneer and reveals the brutal calculus of desperation. But survival cannibalism is only one category. There is also ritual cannibalism, practiced by certain societies as a form of spiritual belief. Anthropologists have documented cultures where consuming human flesh was thought to transfer power, honor the dead, or bind a community together. Among some tribes in Papua New Guinea, ritual cannibalism played a role in funeral rites, with the dead consumed by loved ones as an act of respect and continuity. In ancient Mesoamerica, ritual cannibalism was tied to human sacrifice, where flesh was consumed as part of offerings to the gods. These practices, while shocking to outside observers, were not acts of savagery in the eyes of those who performed them. They were sacred acts, woven into systems of belief. To label them monstrous is to impose our own moral codes onto societies with very different worldviews. There is also the category of criminal or pathological cannibalism, the kind that most closely aligns with the Sawney Bean legend. These are the cases that fascinate and horrify in equal measure, for they are not driven by famine or faith but by something darker within the human psyche. The 15th century French nobleman Gilles de Rais, accused of murdering and possibly consuming children, became a cautionary tale of power corrupted into monstrosity. In the 16th century, Peter Niers, a German bandit, was said to have murdered and eaten the flesh of children as part of occult rituals. Centuries later, in modern times, names like Andrei Chikatilo, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Issei Sagawa would join the ranks of those whose crimes blurred the line between human and beast. These are the figures who remind us that cannibalism is not just a relic of famine or ritual. It can also arise from pathology, obsession, and the collapse of empathy. The Sawney Bean story sits uneasily among these categories. Was it survival cannibalism? The tale insists the clan had no shortage of resources, that they feasted for decades with meat salted and stored. Was it ritual cannibalism? There are no accounts of religious or spiritual motives, no suggestion that their acts were part of a larger belief system. Instead, the Beans fall closest to the category of criminal cannibalism, human beings who, by choice, turn their lives into a grotesque inversion of society, raising their children to hunt, kill, and consume without remorse. This alignment with other criminal cases is part of what makes the story enduring. It places Sawney Bean alongside the world's most infamous monsters, whether real or legendary. Yet, even as we consider these parallels, it is important to recognize that cannibalism stories often serve symbolic purposes. They are not always accounts of literal acts but allegories about fear, morality, and otherness. In medieval Europe, cannibalism was frequently used as an accusation against enemies. Crusaders claimed Muslims and Jews engaged in cannibalism. Colonizers claimed indigenous peoples feasted on human flesh. Such stories justified conquest, demonized opponents, and painted the other as monstrous. In this sense, Sawney Bean's story, whether true or not, participates in a broader tradition of using cannibalism as the ultimate marker of barbarity. Even in folklore and fairy tales, cannibalism plays a central role. Hansel and Gretel face a witch who fattens children to eat them. Little Red Riding Hood confronts a wolf that swallows grandmother's whole. These are not historical accounts but moral stories that use the horror of cannibalism to teach lessons about trust, danger, and survival. Sawney Bean's legend functions in much the same way. It warns travelers of the dangers of isolation. It cautions communities against turning away from law and faith. And it reinforces the notion that the worst monsters may not be supernatural but human. In modern times, the fascination with cannibalism persists in literature, cinema, and popular culture. From Bram Stoker's Dracula, with its blood-drinking aristocrat, to Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter, with his cultivated palate for human flesh, cannibalism has become a shorthand for ultimate horror. These figures, like Sawney Bean, are compelling because they are human. Vampires, werewolves, and demons are terrifying, but they are distant. Cannibals terrify because they are us, people who look like us, live like us, but cross the line we fear most. When viewed in this global and historical context, the legend of Sawney Bean becomes less an isolated tale and more part of a universal pattern. Across cultures and centuries, cannibalism emerges again and again, not only as a reality but as a story we tell ourselves to mark the boundaries of civilization. It is the ultimate taboo, the act that defines what it means to be human by showing us what it means to fall outside of humanity. Sawney Bean's cave, whether real or imagined, joins the graves of Jamestown, the snowdrifts of the Sierra Nevada, the rituals of New Guinea, and the prisons of modern killers in a long, grim lineage of humanity consuming itself. In the end, the Sawney Bean legend gains its power not because it is unique, but because it echoes. It resonates with all these other stories, amplifying them and being amplified in turn. It asks us the same question they all do. How thin is the line between civilization and savagery? And what happens when hunger, whether for food, for power, or for blood, pushes people across it? If Sawney Bean's tale unsettled Scotland, it was because it did not emerge in a vacuum. It slotted neatly into a larger cultural landscape steeped in shadows, folklore, and an uneasy coexistence between myth and memory. Scotland has always been a land of stories, and not all of them were meant to comfort. For every ballad of bravery and clan loyalty, there are darker whispers of creatures, witches, and spirits that haunt the hills, glens, and lochs. To understand how the legend of Sawney Bean endured for centuries, we must see how it resonated with this tapestry of fear. His story was not alone. It belonged to a lineage of Scottish darkness. The geography of Scotland plays its part. This is a country where mist drifts across moors, where lochs stretch into shadowy depths, and where cliffs rise sharply against crashing seas. Such landscapes naturally inspire imagination. Before electricity, before railways, travellers crossed vast stretches of wilderness under only starlight or torch flame. Every cry of an owl, every rustle of brush, every hollowed cave became a stage for stories of the uncanny. The Bean clan's cave fit perfectly into this environment. It was the kind of place that seemed destined for legend, hidden, echoing, and alive with the sound of waves pounding rock. To place cannibals within such a setting was not just believable. It was inevitable. But the Bean story also reflects Scotland's long fascination with figures who exist outside the bounds of ordinary life. Folklore speaks of kelpies, shape-shifting water spirits who lured travellers to watery deaths. Tales of witches abound, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, when Scotland saw some of the most intense witch hunts in Europe. The bogeyman, too, has its Scottish incarnation, a figure used to frighten children into obedience. Sawney Bean is cut from the same cloth, a human bogeyman whose very name became shorthand for terror. Parents are said to have whispered it as a warning: misbehave, and Sawney Bean will come for you. At the same time, Scottish culture has always carried an undercurrent of distrust toward outsiders, and vice versa. For centuries, the Highlands and Lowlands viewed each other with suspicion, while England often painted Scotland as wild and untamable. Legends like Sawney Bean's both reflected and reinforced this tension. Within Scotland, he was a warning against lawlessness, against abandoning faith and community. Beyond Scotland, he was proof to English audiences of Scottish barbarity. In both cases, the legend thrived because it served cultural needs: fear of the wilderness at home, prejudice from abroad. The endurance of the story also owes much to oral tradition. Before literacy was widespread, stories passed from mouth to mouth across generations. Each telling added details, altered emphasis, and adapted the tale to its audience. A farmer might tell of Sawney Bean to warn against travelling alone. A mother might invoke his name to discipline her children. A travelling storyteller might embellish the gore to entertain a tavern crowd. In this way, the legend became part of cultural memory, evolving while remaining recognizable. It did not need official records to survive. It lived in the imagination. As time passed, Sawney Bean's story also fed into literature and art. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sensationalist writers picked it up, folding it into chapbooks and collections of gruesome tales. The Gothic movement in literature, with its fascination for caves, dungeons, and monstrous families, found a perfect subject in the Bean clan. The idea of a hidden lair filled with bones echoed through Gothic novels, inspiring images of subterranean horrors and corrupted lineages. Later, in the 20th century, horror cinema would pick up the same themes. Films like Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, which tells of a cannibal family living in the American desert, owe much to the Sawney Bean myth. The Scottish cannibal clan had crossed not only centuries but oceans, becoming part of global horror culture. In Scotland itself, the legend has been commercialised and retold in countless forms. Guides point to Benane Cave as a tourist site, spinning the old story for curious visitors. Writers and filmmakers revisit it, adapting it for modern audiences. In this way, Sawney Bean has become part of Scotland's cultural brand, a dark attraction woven into the nation's identity. Tourists who come for castles, lochs, and whiskey also find themselves drawn to the shadow of the Bean family, their curiosity tinged with unease. Yet the legend also speaks to something deeper within Scottish identity, a recognition of the duality of its past. Scotland is a land of enlightenment, home to great thinkers, philosophers, and reformers. But it is also a land of blood feuds, witch hunts, and folk terrors. Sawney Bean embodies this darker half, a figure who reminds us that civilization and savagery are not separate worlds but two sides of the same coin. He is Scotland's nightmare version of itself, a mirror held up to its own history of violence and hardship. Folklorists often point out that stories like Sawney Beans endure because they articulate unspoken fears. The Beans lived in a cave, cut off from society, devouring travellers. In symbolic terms, they were the fear of what happens when community breaks down. In a land where famine and isolation were real threats, the Beans represented the nightmare of neighbours turned into predators. They reminded listeners of the fine line between survival and savagery, between home and lair, between family and pack. In this way, the legend was not only entertainment but a cultural safety valve, a way to confront and contain the terrors of life in a harsh land. Even today, the story lingers in Scotland's cultural imagination. Writers continue to debate whether it was fact or fiction. Tourists continue to peer into the cave. Children continue to hear whispers of the cannibal clan. In a country with no shortage of legends, of Nessie and Loch Ness, of ghosts in castles, of witches burned at the stake, Sawney Bean stands apart. He is not mystical, not fantastical, not otherworldly. He is human. And that makes him the most frightening figure of all. Thus, the tale of Sawney Bean is as much about Scotland's memory as it is about horror. It reflects its landscapes, its fears, its history of being painted as other, and its fascination with stories of the uncanny. Whether he was real or not matters less than the role he plays in the nation's imagination. For in the end, Sawney Bean is more than a cannibal. He is a cultural ghost, haunting the cliffs of Ayrshire, haunting the pages of history, and haunting the collective memory of a land where shadows linger longer than the sun. The tale of Sawney Bean begins with whispers on lonely roads and ends with flames in a public square. But centuries later, his shadow has not vanished. Instead, it lingers on the cliffs of Ayrshire, in the dark recesses of Benane Cave, and in the imaginations of all who hear his name. Whether Sawney Bean was real or nothing more than a grotesque fabrication, his legend refuses to die. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Monsters may fade, but the stories we tell about them endure far longer than flesh. As we step back from the details of the tale, the ambushes, the butchered bodies, the cave of salted flesh, we are left with a question that has no easy answer. Was Sawney Bean ever a living man? Or was he a phantom conjured by fear and prejudice? Historians argue over the lack of records, over the suspicious timing of the story's publication, over the way it fits too neatly into English propaganda against Scotland. Skeptics point to the impossibility of 50 people surviving for decades unnoticed, murdering 1,000 travellers without leaving evidence. And yet, belief persists. The cave still draws visitors. Guides still tell the story. Locals still whisper of the clan that once lived in darkness. The persistence of Sawney Bean reveals something profound about human nature. We cling to stories that frighten us not because they are true, but because they reflect truths we cannot face directly. Cannibalism is the ultimate taboo, the act that collapses the distinction between predator and prey, between human and beast. By imagining a family who live by it, we confront our deepest fears about what lies beneath the surface of civilization. Sawney Bean is terrifying not because he is distant, but because he is close. He is not a demon from another world. He is us, stripped of morality and bound only to hunger. This is why the legend feels timeless. It is less about Scotland in 1726 than about humanity at large. Every culture has its monsters, every society its tales of those who cross forbidden lines. The Beans stand alongside the witches of Salem, the werewolves of Germany, the vampires of Eastern Europe, and the serial killers of modern cities. They are part of a continuum of horror that stretches across history. Each new retelling is less about whether they existed and more about why we need them. Monsters, real or imagined, are mirrors. They show us the darkness we carry within ourselves. There is also something deeply unsettling about the Beans as a family. Most monsters in folklore are solitary: one witch, one wolf, one ghost. But the Beans are many. They are not a single deviant, but a whole community, a clan bound together by blood and by shared horror. This collective evil unsettles us because it suggests that monstrosity can be inherited, normalized, even celebrated within a group. It reminds us that the bonds we usually trust most, family, kinship, community, can be twisted into something unrecognizable. That inversion may be the most frightening aspect of the story. Sornay Bean did not just kill. He raised killers. He did not just consume. He created a culture of consumption. And so the legend survives, retold across centuries not only in Scotland but far beyond. It surfaces in Gothic novels, in penny dreadfuls, in horror films and tourist brochures. Each retelling adapts it to new fears, new audiences, new contexts. In the 18th century, it was propaganda. In the 19th, it was a Gothic curiosity. In the 20th, it inspired cinema. In the 21st, it remains an internet-age legend, whispered in dark corners of the web, shared as macabre trivia, or reenacted in ghost tours along the Scottish coast. Sornay Bean has outlived kings, empires, and entire centuries. And still, his name is spoken. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: whether or not Sornay Bean ever lived, his story is real in the sense that it lives in us. The fear is real. The shudder that runs down the spine is real. The unease that lingers after hearing his name is real. We may never prove that a family of cannibals dwelt in Benane Cave, but the legend reveals truths about humanity that cannot be denied. That fear of the wilderness, fear of the other, fear of what hunger and isolation can do, these are eternal. So, what remains of Sornay Bean today? A cave, a legend, a name, but also a haunting reminder that civilization is fragile. Strip away law, faith, and community, and the abyss yawns wide. The Beans may be myth, but the conditions that gave birth to their legend, poverty, famine, violence, propaganda, were very real. In that sense, the Sornay Bean story is not a warning about the past but about the present and future. It asks us to consider, what would we do if stripped of everything, left in the dark, left with only hunger? Would we cling to morality? Or would we, too, descend into the abyss? As the waves crash endlessly against the Ayrshire cliffs, Benane Cave remains. To enter it today is to confront silence, damp stone, and the knowledge that this place, whether or not it ever housed a family of cannibals, has been branded forever in human imagination as a lair of darkness. Visitors peer into its mouth and feel the same unease that people have felt for centuries. It is not just a cave. It is a story carved into stone, a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we create in our minds. And so we close, not with certainty, but with unease. Sornay Bean's reality may never be proven, but his legend remains one of the darkest in Scottish folklore, a tale that devours logic and feeds on fear. In the end, what remains is not the man, nor the family, nor the bones. What remains is the echo of the story itself, passed from generation to generation like a shadow that refuses to fade. Sornay Bean lives not in flesh, but in imagination, and perhaps that is the most terrifying place of all.